I ended up coming back to the States, and I went back out to Holloman Air Force Base for a while. That's when I met up with Jim Morrison. You know, the Doors.
Oh yeah, wasn't his like father like a military general?
His father was an admiral, was a rear admiral. People didn't know that, and I used to hang out with Jim Morris. With Jim Morris, I learned to drive his Mustang, and Jim Morrison would, drink liquor while I would drive the Mustang. That's how I got to learn how to drive was through him. But I hung out at Holloman for a while, and it got around to about 1975, and I was contacted again by that group, and all I knew was that NASA was interested in me, and I had not had anything to do with NASA since, ever since Ham died, and so they wanted me to go apply for a job at NASA. I didn't know what I was applying for. So the day came for my interview. I went up to NASA. I sat down with them. They asked me a series of questions. And one of the questions they asked me was, do you believe in God? And, I'm a dual religion. I was born Catholic, but I take the religion of the Paiute, the Native American Paiutes on Nellis Air Force Base. After the interview, I didn't hear from them for about 2 weeks. And I get called back in, and they said, well, you're hired. And come to find out, now all the astronauts before then was asked, do you believe in God? And every one of them answered yes. I did not know that William Rutledge was atheist. I did not know that the Snyder woman was atheist. I did not know that. All right, but because I took the religion of the Native American Paiutes, they said, well, you have the religion of the savage. You have the religion of the savage. So I was picked along with William Rutledge and that woman to the left. Now, the far man to the right, that's Gerald Ford.
So was he president? So I think this is what, 76?
That was around 74, I believe that picture was taken, because it was right after Nixon resigned. Now, my understanding of it was the Russians contacted Richard Nixon first, and they were wanting to do a joint mission. But what happened, Richard Nixon knew of the crashed spacecraft before he resigned in 1974. He knew that. But because of Watergate, he resigned, and Gerald Ford was appointed to take his place. So that's a picture of Gerald Ford and Brezhnev and Snyder and Rutledge there, all together, sitting, having the they're discussing the joint mission. Now, after I was hired, I had to go in for some additional brush up training.
Jimmy, I have a really good question. I know you're, but let me ask it real quick. So Ricky's asking, this is a question I'm thinking about. So it's 1974, and over here on the Wikipedia, it says Mae Jemison was the first black female in space. That was September 20th of 1992. But here we see somebody in 1974.
It's a black ops mission, James. It's a black ops mission. It doesn't exist. What you're looking at to the left of William is the first black female in space. She's been educated in the West. She's from the Congo. And she, right where the astronaut chimpanzees, the Air Force got those astronaut chimpanzees from the Congo. I believe William may have been one of the hunters that bagged these astronaut chimpanzees. They were brought back, sold to the Air Force, and they were used as early test pilots for the space program. Now, let me get back to
hold on, one last comment. And you can see right there, there's a Soviet Union flag right next to American flag. So at that time in the mid-70s, we were told that the Soviet Union was America's biggest enemy, right?
Yes, it's all a big show here, James. Let me get back to the story because we're never going to finish. I know you're interested, but we have many more interesting things coming tonight that pales this picture here. When I got back to Holloman Air Force Base, they said, "Look, you need to brush up. You got to do some training in the swimming pool, underwater, wearing the astronaut suit." So I did a few weeks of working in the pool in the astronaut suit. That's the nearest that they could simulate working in space was in the pool. I did that for about 2-3 weeks, simulating what astronauts do in space. They had a special fit me for the suit. Every suit is custom built around the astronaut. What happened was we're getting around to the year 1975, and right before the mission, William Rutledge was in training, and I'm not sure where William trained. I'm thinking it was around Vandenberg, but I'm not totally sure of it. But he trained separate from me. But it was unlikely. You didn't know if you were going to come back or not from the moon. So they told him first he couldn't go home. They kept us separate because they wanted to make sure if one of us came down for cold, we wouldn't affect each other one. So you had 3 astronauts. You had William Rutledge, you had Leonid Snyder, there was one Russian, Vladimir Morkov, General Vladimir Morkov. Now, that general allegedly should have died in 1967. He was a cosmonaut. Russia had a cosmonaut. The parachute didn't open on one of their spacecraft, and the spacecraft crashed and bursted the flames. So the Russians staged the death of one of their, that's him to the left there, Vladimir Morkov. They staged his death. Now that was in 1967. Williams' notes seem to indicate that the Russians knew of the spacecraft as early as 1966. So while we were busy on the front side of the moon picking up rocks, the Russians were busy sending probes back there during that time period. But come to find out, General Vladimir Markov, he was terminally ill with cancer. He was given about 8 months to a year to live. So he had terminal cancer at that time. So Russia volunteered him to be one of the cosmonauts on Apollo 20. Now, Apollo 20, I'm going to get to it now. When NASA shut down, after Wernher von Braun retired, after the Apollo 16, I believe he retired around Apollo 16. By Apollo 17 was a new director from NASA, if I remember right. But what they did, all these Apollo rockets were outdated by that time. They had already had on the drawing board Space Shuttle Columbia, what we would know as Space Shuttle Columbia. So when they shut down the Apollo production of the Apollo missile, they turned that back over to the General Service Administration, and the General Service Administration turned it back over to the Air Force. So the Air Force ended up with all the Apollo rockets. Only thing an Apollo rocket was a modified ICBM missile with extra fuel tanks on it, James. So it went back into the Air Force's inventory. They have like a production line, just like you have cars coming down production line. They just stop mass producing them. So there's plenty of spacecraft, booster rockets, engines, all this stuff laying around went to the Air Force. So what happened was when William Rutledge came in, they were taking these spacecraft, put them together. That some of them weren't even painted. Okay, some of those spacecraft weren't even painted. And they didn't want to paint them because it would make the paint to paint one of those spacecraft would run around 450 pounds of paint. So they didn't paint them. That was more fuel that they could carry rather than the weight of the paint. So a lot of the spacecraft were not painted. So in August of 1975, William takes off in Apollo 20 with him, Snyder, and General Vladimir Morkov. They took off. Actually, Apollo 19 took off first. There was a guy in there named Reynolds. His last name was Reynolds. He was the commander of Apollo 19. Apollo 19 took off first. Apollo 20 took off second. And I was in Apollo 21. I took off last. So by the time that I took off, I'm thinking there's 2 spacecraft ahead of me. We're sending 3 spacecraft together. We're following each other. By the time that I got in orbit, Rutledge had already went down on the surface, and so had Apollo 19. I'm the last one going around the moon. But coming around the moon, I see a disabled spacecraft, and it's the limb and the spacecraft is together. The command module and the limb is still together. You have to separate them, and then you bring the limb down. This spacecraft there's no power to it, but it's rolling like a barrel. And when we pulled up beside it, I was thinking it was Apollo 19, but it wasn't. It had the markings of Apollo 19, but it wasn't Apollo 19. And I start feeling suspicious about, well, what's going on here? And I timed this spacecraft, it would take about 19 seconds before it could make a complete rollover. So it was turning real slow. There's no power to it. It hadn't been separated from the limb. So right off, I knew something wasn't right as far as the numbers to these spacecraft, 19, 20, and 21. You can't have 2 19s. It didn't make any sense. Again, there's no markings on the spacecraft because they weren't painted. But it should have been Apollo 19, but it wasn't. Now, I knew Apollo 20 had a sickle on it. That was the only thing that was painted. The Russians insisted that the sickle hammer be painted on that side of the spacecraft. This one did not have it. So that should have been 19, but it wasn't. So that told me there was more spacecraft involved than what was told to me. The plan was for me to board the spacecraft, the derelict spacecraft. So we sat there for about 2.5, 3 hours. I was steadily counting the rotations of the craft. You know, we have to maneuver our spacecraft close to it. We don't want to get bumped, but we want to get as close as we can to it. And the deal was that I had some extra propellant, canisters of extra propellant for this spacecraft, and I'm going to board it. So I spent about 2.5 hours looking at this from about maybe 50 feet from it. And I've got to get onto this craft. So what I did, I shot out a rope to it with a grappling hook. And I took the propellant. I've got it tied to the rope. The first rope I shot out was strictly for me. So when I shot the first rope out, the grappling hook caught part of the limb's lower gear, landing gear, and it rode me just like a spool of thread that you roll up, a spool that you roll the thread up. It just pulled me into it where I could cling to it and get onto it. Then once I was on it, I got in there and I was able to uncoupling the propellant tank. And then the other astronaut shot another line over, that was tied to these propellants. And we did the same thing. It just wound that rope up like thread on a spindle. And it brought over the propellant. And I was able to secure the propellant, get it hooked up where we could blow the thrusters. So once I got the propellant hooked up, I'm back inside and I find 2 astronauts dead in there. And one of them had threw up in the suit. I presume that they died, they asphyxiated. Okay. When the limb and the command module together, it's very unstable. Okay. It's not balanced very well. And it had been modified with a new door on it, a hatch. Do you remember when the United States sent a spacecraft up to the moon, and the Russians did some years prior to that, and they shook hands where the cosmonaut opened the door to the American capsule, and they shook hands. It was in the newspapers. That was a goodwill mission. That was all up front. But when they added that door, it made it unstable because it added more weight to the spacecraft. But when I was able to get in there and get it all hooked up, I was able to stabilize it from rolling. And once I was able to stop the roll, I left the bodies in the command module, and I got back into the limb, and I was able to bring the limb down and land on the moon. So that's how I got onto the moon. I didn't use the lander on the spacecraft I was in. I used the lander, the limb on the derelict spacecraft to come down.
And how old were you at this time, Jimmy?
I was around about 18 at that time. No, I'll take that back. I was around about 20 at that time. 20. 76 was when the mission occurred. I was 20. But I came down, I'm coming down, I'm looking down, and I'm seeing a spacecraft about a mile from me. And I thought it might be Apollo 19, the other Apollo 19. So when I got down, I landed, went, unloaded the rover, got the rover unpacked, and got it set up and rode out about a mile. And when I got closer to that spacecraft, it wasn't Apollo 19, it was a Russian spacecraft. Well, then it got even more confusing. What the hell is this Russian spacecraft doing on the backside of the moon? I got one derelict one above me that's not 19. And then I got another one on about a mile from where I land is Russian. So instead of heading to the main wreck, the mothership, I went to see, what's going on. So when I got there to this Russian spacecraft, the hatch is ajar. That's not a good sign. And I crawled up the ladder. I got into this Russian spacecraft, and I have lights on my suit, And I mean, the whole inside that spacecraft, there was nothing but blood, massive amounts of blood. And when blood is, I mean, without gravity, it was all over the walls, it was on the floor, it was everywhere. It's like a bomb going off and blood going everywhere in zero gravity. So the whole inside was covered in blood. And on top of that, everything's tore up. You know, they give you like rock hammers, you know, like geologists use, you know, when they go out in the field, pointed hammers to break these rocks open. Well, the whole inside was tore up. I mean, like someone had took an axe and just tore the whole inside of the craft up. Wires hanging everywhere, busted circuits. But I went over and I was able to fire the computer up. And I don't read Russian, but I knew the date on it didn't correspond with the mission. And I thought, you know, I'm like at a crime scene. I don't know what's happened. There's blood everywhere. I'm in a derelict Russian spacecraft. So I got back out. I went back out, and I'm seeing footsteps. And they weren't the footsteps of an American. Their shoes are flat. Ours is rigid. So I followed the cosmonauts' footsteps. There was a crater adjacent to the to where he landed, and I went. You know, we're not supposed to go down into the crater where it's dark, because when you get into the dark areas of the crater, it gets cold down there. Now you can either turn the power up on your suit to warm your suit, but on the other hand, you're draining your battery, your power pack. So I went down into it a short distance, and I mean, I was freezing. My legs were stinging from the coldness. But when I got down there, I found the cosmonaut. He was dead. And I grabbed him and I dragged him up to the top of the crater where I could examine him into the light. He was probably about 80 feet down in the crater, in the dark part of it, before I found him. And when I got him up, I looked at him. His face shield is broken, and I examined him, and he was mummified. He was frozen stiff, and his suit was all tore up, like he had been struggling. I believe that there had to be more than one cosmonaut, but for some reason he went down into the crater. Okay, so I ended up leaving his body. I initially thought it was a crime scene. I thought, well, maybe the American astronaut and the cosmonauts got to fighting. Or maybe they went loco and the two cosmonauts went after each other. But I was sure I was at some type of crime scene because of the violent nature of the struggle. So I left there, and I'm heading towards the mothership. And before I got to the mothership, I see another spacecraft. That is Apollo 19. And when I got to Apollo 19, I tapped on the hatch. They went ahead and put their suits on, and they opened the hatch. They let me in. And once I got in there, we resealed the hatch on Apollo 19, and there is Evie. She's in there. She is naked, and she is laying on a table. And so they're examining her. And
is that Jimmy? Look at Michael's feed.
Well, she still had the tubes on her face. We're in the process of taking the tubes off, and I examined her. I touched her, and she is frozen solid. Her blood is, you can't push in on her skin. She is solid as a block of ice.
And Jimmy,
Okay.
was there an atmosphere in the craft, or is it all in?
Which craft are you talking?
The one that you're in right now, the Apollo 19, where this body is.
There's atmosphere in there.
Okay.
Now, she was taken out of, I'm sure she was frozen when she was taken out of the mother craft. But when she was in there, you could knock on her skin like wood, just like you knock on a door. Her skin was so hard you could not. It was not soft. It was. She was like a block of ice. So they removed the tubes from her, and some yellow liquid came out. And so at that time, you know, my mission is to go to the craft. I'd already made contact with Apollo 19, and I'm thinking William and General Vladimir Markov. I'm thinking that they're at the Apollo craft. Excuse me, the mothership. I'm thinking they're in the alien craft. So I tell Reynolds, the commander Reynolds, I said, look, I've got to meet up with William. So they went ahead and put their helmets back on, and we opened the hatch. I got back out. And after they sealed the craft back up, they went back to examining her. Okay. I walked in on the examination. The examination continued after they resealed the craft. So from there, I'm going to go to the main spacecraft. When I get to the main spacecraft, see, you have road 1 and road 2. Road 2 is from the Apollo 19 craft to the spacecraft. And then road 1 is from Williams spacecraft to the foreign spacecraft. And you had road 3, which is from my spacecraft to the mother craft. So those are the 3 roads where our tracks are down there in the lunar soil. So when I get to road 1, I get there and I do not see William Rutledge. He has already been there and left. So you have so much air and so much power in your back seat. I decided to go on into the spacecraft. And when I went into the break, well, before I went into the break, I'm going to describe the shape and size of this spacecraft. This spacecraft, go to the main spacecraft, James, the big one. All right, back out. That spacecraft is 4.2 miles long, is a third of a mile high and a third of a mile wide. So we're talking about a very large spacecraft. It's cylinder shaped. There's all kinds of strange writings, hexagon, similar to pictographs, like what you see.
Yeah, I've got like a 3D model I could show here real quick. If you want to see it.
Fine, but let me go off my story, James.
Okay.
Because we have a lot to cover tonight. The break in the side of the craft is as high as Eiffel Tower is. If that gives you any kind of indication, just the break in the side of the craft. So I went in the side, and there's lunar soil in there. I presumed it looked like like sand on a beach when it after a storm it is smooth, So I'm thinking the soil just got in there and it got wet. Was my impression. It was real smooth. And I get into this craft and I'm walking around in it. And when I got to the size of the craft, I'm able to walk. I could do a 360. I could walk from the side on the inside. I could walk from the inside, walk upside down to the top, and walk back around. In other words, it had gravity inside the craft. That was the first thing I noticed.
Could you give an estimate of how old it might have been?
The first estimate was 1.2 billion years. Now, that was based on the crater that it sat in. William Rutledge thought it had been there since the time of when the pyramids were built in Egypt. I don't know where he got that. I estimated 42,000 years because when I would channel Mona said 42,000 years. And I believe that she based that on the rotation of the Earth. I don't know where Mona comes from in space, but Mona said 42,000 years, Earth years. Okay. So not only does the inside of this craft have gravity, I go in there, I see some black triangular blocks. They look like little pyramids. They're made out of some type of ceramic. I thought it was similar to the ceramic the ceramic tiles underneath the space shuttle, but they're not flat. But they look like they're made out of some type of ceramic material, and they were slightly greasy, kind of oily. This yellowish liquid. It seemed like it was soaked in it, but it would come onto the glove, and it was oily because I could rub my fingers together and they would glide very easily. And then I saw vegetation that looked like, it's kind of like you have a garden and you have a freeze the night before and it wilts the plants. So I was picking up this vegetation and it looked like it had withered from the extreme cold, but it was perfectly preserved. And then when I looked onto the floor, it looked like some type of liquid had ran over the lunar soil and compacted down like you would on a beach. Like the waves going onto the beach, it makes the sand smooth. So I go through this craft and I'm climbing over some very large equipment. It turned out it was a rocket launcher. I believe that's what the two other smaller triangular spacecraft was launched from. There's the cigar-shaped one, and then there's two triangular craft that are out beside it, two other wrecks. Okay.
Jimmy, I've got a quick question. So you entered into this derelict craft with there was a hole the size of the Eiffel Tower. Now, is there actual an atmosphere on the moon? Because I've heard from, I don't remember where, but it's there is a slight breathable atmosphere.
I'm getting to that. The cosmonaut. I'm going to back up a little bit here. I want to inject something. The cosmonaut went in there. He found he called it, and this is a slang term, but on the wall it looked like a hair dryer. Like you go to a public restroom and you wash your hands, and then you put your hands underneath this dryer and it dries it off. So this box is hanging off the side of the hull, but when you get to this box, you step on these two metal plates, and when you step on the plates, you put your hand underneath this dryer, and you're instantly teleported to another part of the ship. Now, we're not talking an elevator here. You're teleported. You vanish and you end up in another part of the ship. So that's how they move, is through this teleport system. But if you read William's notes, William says that you can hear a bang when you teleport. Now, because there's no atmosphere, you can't hear anything. You're not supposed to hear anything in space because there's no air. You have nothing to bounce off your eardrums, okay? William said he heard air. He could hear it even inside his helmet. Now, the reason I know there's air on the moon, about a quarter of a mile from the spacecraft, there's a city. Now, I believe that when this spacecraft crashed, the occupants in this craft, they cannibalized the craft. They took parts of beams out there, and they probably had machinery in there, and because there were mats down in that crater. And I believe that they took parts out of that spacecraft. They built what we call the city. Some people call it the junkyard. I think the Russians call it the junkyard, and we call it the city, or it's either vice versa. So if you hear me say the city or the junkyard, it's basically the same thing. But what you're seeing is parts taken out of that craft, and they're trying to build a makeshift place where they can live. Since I've been in that little city, and there's you go down into the underground part, we have a small reactor there, a small modular reactor. So there's power in the underground part, and there's air there. Now, on Earth, when you send somebody into the ocean real deep, they have to go into a decompression chamber, or you'll get what you call the bends, and you have to slowly raise the pressure up to as normalized, or you come with the bends. Now, on the moon, if you get down in the craters, you ever seen these people? They walk around town. They got a little canister on their hip. They may have CPOD. Smokers, but they need a little booster, so they carry a little tiny air bottle, and they breathe through a tube. You know what I mean? You can actually, after you decompressed, you can take a booster tank and put it on your hip, run two little hoses into your nose, and walk around on the moon. There's a little bit of air, but it's down in the very lower parts. See, air is heavy. It's going to settle in the lower parts of the crater. And every time there's been activity on the moon, people have reported seeing strange lights in these craters. So there is life on the moon. There's tall grays. I've encountered them on prior missions. Apollo 18, they had some astronauts became affected. So I've been to the moon prior at the Apollo 18 site where those two astronauts died that were infected some years earlier.
And what about the parasites?
There are parasites in the dust. They look very much like a slug does. If you get into a swamp, you get slugs on you. Leeches is what I'm trying to say here.
But But that would mean that there's an ecosystem there. That there's life forms. Right?
There's life forms there, but it seems to be internal, maybe in the lava tube, deep down in it. The surface is barren, but there's parasites that look like jellyfish. They're translucent, but they're like leeches. Once they get on your skin, I had two of them on me at one time. I had to go to Holloman. They treated me with chemotherapy, and that's how these leeches fell off of me, is through chemotherapy. So there are parasites in the dust, and there's also bacteria from these creatures in these ruins. So which we have no known immunity to. Now, I'm going to get back to the ship. When I got into the ship, I went into the fort section where the pilot sits, where Mona was removed from. And I took the flight computer, I dismantled and removed the flight computer from her spacecraft. All right, that's been transported back to Earth with me and Mona. I'm going to get to Mona in a little bit here. But while I'm in the spacecraft, I'm looking around when I'm taking this computer out, and I'm coming back down, and I'm seeing more of these plants. They seem to be alive, and they seem to be growing. It's like vegetables that are 100 feet high. I presume that these plants that are growing in there, there's trays below them, and they drip a yellowish, oily substance in these trays, and they collect there's a pump in there, and it goes into the tank. So these plants have been in there. We call them vampire creepers. Now, William's the one that named it the vampire creepers. When he was in there, he put a camera up, and he went in there, and when he left out, that camera filmed all to the next day when William went in the second day. And it wasn't till the second day that they were, going back through the films that they realized these plants were moving. They do move. They move very slow, but the plants are alive. So that's why they call them vampire creepers. Now, what happened was, at some point, I never did meet up with William because I don't know where he went down at. And I have only so much oxygen in my tanks to get back to my craft. So what happened on the way back, when I left the spacecraft to go back to my craft, I stopped back at Apollo 19, where Reynolds is at. And the hatch is open, which is another bad sign. And I went in, and both men are missing. Both astronauts are missing. And Mona, when I left, she's on the examination table. Well, Mona has gotten back into a bunk or to a hammock, and she's gone back to sleep. But what had happened, because this was filmed, what had happened, Reynolds uploaded all this to the computer. But what had happened when I left, when I was there the first time, Mona started to unthaw, and she got to the point where she was limp, and they turned her over to examine her, and they thought they heard blood moving in her veins, and then they thought that she had made a moan. But when they turned her back over, her eyes opened. They had already removed the tubes from her face. And her eyes opened, and she became startled. She jumped off the table, and there was some mist that occurred. I don't know where the mist came from, but Reynolds and the other astronaut was able just enough in time to put their helmets on, and then they passed out. And the camera that Reynolds had on his suit when he was passed out, Mona leaned over and was looking at him while he was unconscious, laying on the floor of the Apollo spacecraft. So what Mona did after the helmets were on, of course, she didn't put them on. They were Reynolds and other astronauts who put their own helmets on. She went back out, and I presume at this point, and this is from what I understood of it, William and the cosmonaut had doubled back, and Reynolds and the cosmonaut got there before I did, and they went in, and they were the first ones that found Mona in there. But what had happened was, before they found Mona, and I'm not sure, but Mona had William had collected some samples the day before from the spacecraft of this yellow liquid they call it angel tears, I believe is what they call it.
That was a vampire tears.
No, I believe they called it golden tears. They just made up the name. They called it golden tears, this yellow substance. Now, what's unique about this yellow substance is, back in 1947, during the Roswell crash, they examined one of the extraterrestrials, and when he was being dissected, they found this yellow liquid, kind of like slime or this yellowish stuff in the back of his mouth. It was also yellowish. And during the 1947 crash, when the soldiers came upon the craft, there was 2 triangular craft that took off. And William said that he read William read the autopsy report, and William also read the report, but the report seems to indicate that the 2 craft outside where the maiden craft is, that those 2 other small triangular craft were the ones that were at the Roswell crash. That's what William thought. So this is just conjecture. William thought the 2 craft that are on the moon were the 2 craft that came down in Roswell on a rescue mission, but never did recover the remains. What had happened, William went in there with the cosmonaut, and they find Mona there, but she's already gotten a hold of the golden tears, and she's drank it. It may be some type of nourishment for her. And because there was little to no oxygen, she went back to sleep. Okay, she went back to sleep in the spacecraft. And Reynolds and the other astronaut is gone. And William and the cosmonaut can't figure out where Reynolds is at. So they drive back to Apollo 20 and report back in that they can't find the crew of Apollo 19. So they get some sleep. NASA's going, well, not NASA, Mission Control is going to work on it during the night. They'll brief them in the morning. So the next morning, William they explore the 2 smaller triangular craft adjacent to the main craft. Now his findings are exactly the same as mine. I examined the closest one from the craft. It may be 120 meters wide and maybe 600 meters long, and it's triangular. You enter into the back of it by the what would be the propulsion system, through a round hatch. That's not the craft I'm talking about, James. Go into the other smaller craft, the pictures that I sent you, if you would. Get out of that. Go back to the pictures I sent you earlier tonight.
Okay, well, just tell me. I don't know which.
Just keep scrolling through.
Go back. Oh, that's not that one. Okay.
Go and those pictures there. Just keep scrolling through them.
Okay.
There. Stop. Do you see that thing that's hanging out on that top right one? Well, that's the nose cone with a smaller triangular craft. And that's probably William in the back of it there, on the back of the.
So who made that craft?
I believe those two smaller craft were inside the bigger craft. I think those were scout craft. That was launched prior to the crashing. The main craft was losing power. I believe they got into that one and flew it alongside the main one till it went down. But when I went into the smaller craft, you go into the back and there's a tunnel like in the back of it. And there were like these holes that would drop off, maybe about 6 inches wide, about 8 inches deep. And there were dead insects in these holes. I believe it to be locusts or grasshoppers. Locusts is what I would say. See, those are all alien ruins there you're looking at. Some type of underground base. I wasn't able to get in that one, but I was able to get into the spacecraft. But I say about 60 feet of a tunnel in the back of it is where these insects were at. And then when you climb through it, you go into a bigger room. There's seats in there like bleachers. And then you crawl up another tunnel in there and you come out in the nose part of it. And in the nose of it, there's no instruments. There's just a chair in there. I believe it's flown by telepathic thought. There's no gauges in that craft. So it's flown telepathically. The hull is the engine. Okay. So it's powered by thought.
Was it also alive too?
If the occupant is alive, it's alive. It's flown by thought. It's all telepathic to fly this thing. Now, off towards the front of it, blue ways back behind the flight room or where the pilot would sit, there's another room. I couldn't get into it. There was a round hole, maybe about 10 inches diameter. There's no scenes on it. It looks like it was poured, like it's molded. So there's no metal panels. You can't find any panels or rivets in this craft. But in the this other room, side room, there's bodies in there like they've been butchered. Heads, torsos, legs, human remains, like a laboratory of some site.
And that's what causing those cattle mutilations.
Well,
Humans.
I do know in the 1947 Roswell crash, one of the things that made everybody quiet, they also found in the wreckage human remains. They were cut up like you would use a laser. There was human torsos and heads and legs and hands, like they're dissecting the body. So this craft here, what was in it was similar to the Roswell crash, like it was collecting body parts. Now, I don't know why. I don't know if they're cannibal or if they just collect it for scientific reasons. But there was humans that were cut up in that craft, and William Rutledge had a panic attack. He absolutely panicked in there, and the cosmonaut was the one that got him under control. So it freaked William out very bad.
How old were the body parts? I mean, if the ship's 42,000 years old, I mean, were the body parts pretty fresh?
Well, see, that's the $64 question. If the main craft went down 42,000 years ago and the Roswell crash was in 1947, who knows if these craft were operating? I believe Williams seems to think that these craft were the original two that was seen at Roswell as the military, as the Air Force pulled up, two triangular craft took off into the sky. Now, William thinks that those were the two craft involved. I can't tell you. I can't tell you how old the bodies are in it. Like I said, you got a geologist saying 1.2 billion years for the big craft. And then you have Williams saying, well, he thinks it's been there since the pyramid times. And then me, I'm channeling, and I don't know how, what Mona told me was 42,000 Earth years. So maybe those craft, maybe they have been there 42,000. Maybe these craft here flew to 1947, and after that they might just parked it. I don't know. So getting back, after I had explored that craft, I did try to get into that underground complex to the other side, but wherever, I could never figure out how to get in. I'm sure if I dug, we had some equipment that we dug around it. I'm sure I could find a hatch to get into it. It's just covered up by the lunar soil. But what happened was, getting back to Rutledge and Commander Reynolds, and this is before I could find either one of them, William went back into the main mother craft, and when he was getting samples of the golden tears where this plant was dripping this liquid into these glass bottles, well, William was filling up these two bottles of this liquid, these golden tears. A glove fell out of the vine, and it was William's glove was white and black. This was white and gray, and it had some numbers on it. But it turned out that was Reynolds' glove. It had blood on it. So at some point, Reynolds re-enters the main craft, and he ends up dying in there, or either is attacked in there. They never did find his body or the other astronaut's body. So Reynolds, so what happened was, time is up. There's not enough oxygen left or power in the batteries. It's time for William and Valdemar to go get in the spacecraft, take off. That is the actual location. I have the longitude and latitude of that wreck. I'll try to give them to you later tonight if I can find it. But
this is on the dark side of the moon?
The dark side. But anyway, I'm getting back to my story. They take off, but what had happened, they refilled one of the bottles with the golden tears. but before he takes off, they sit about an hour in the spacecraft while they talk to mission control. And Williams seems to think that the Russians and the Americans got into a bit of a conversation there. But what happened was they ordered William to leave the bottle of golden tears on the moon. He's not to transport the golden tears back to Earth. They were very frightened of a germ like an epidemic. So it was determined by the scientific team on Earth not to bring back golden tears because it was considered a biological agent to leave it. But they didn't.
Well, but they did, though, Jimmy.
They didn't follow orders.
Okay.
And what had happened, they brought the bottle of golden tears into the Apollo 20 limb, and they blasted it back up, and they got back in orbit. They were able to meet back up with the command module. And once they linked back up, they all got into the capsule. And so you have Snyder, Vladimir is in there along with William, and this is secret, okay? And so what happened? This cosmonaut, when they all got back up into the command module, Snyder had to examine him, and because she's an infectious disease specialist, so they all had to get naked and examine one another for any signs of any rashes or anything. It turned out that this cosmonaut, that's when they found out they had terminal cancer. That
Which one?
you can't stay on that. You have to flip.
Okay.
You have to flip the page. Just keep scrolling.
Okay.
Right there to top left.
Oh, that's right. You were saying that earlier. But
all right, that guy there is the one that supposedly died. The cosmonaut. He's the one that supposedly died in 1967. He's the one that had the terminal cancer, and that's when Snyder examined him. And what it was, he confided in both of them. He says, and he was glad that he went on the mission, that the mission he wanted to know before he died, was there really, what was it like on the moon? All right, so what had happened, he wanted to drink the golden tears. And so they ended up, all three made a pact. So they took the bottle and they opened it. And it floats, the liquid floats in the spacecraft. And they all drank the golden tears. And after all three of them had consumed that liter bottle of the golden tears, they jettisoned the bottle out of the craft. I'm not sure if they had to put their suits on to open the hatch up, but they ended up getting rid of the bottle, getting rid of the evidence. But after they consumed it, and I'm going by what William wrote, he said he felt kind of strange when he did it. He said he felt like he could read the mind of Snyder and the cosmonaut, and then the cosmonaut said something similar, that they could read each other's thoughts without speaking. Now that was the first odd thing that they reported. And then they said they felt kind of a tingling going through their body, like an electrical tingle. you know. And so this went on for a while, this kind of an unusual feeling telepathically, they could hear each other's thoughts. But what had happened when they got back to Earth, they splashed down in the ocean, and there was a submarine, I think it was the USS Fish. Now, when I came back a couple of days later, and the same thing is repeated for me, except one thing. I have Mona with me. I took Mona. I was ordered to bring Mona back. And the only thing I can recall of my trip back is that sometime during the trip, and I believe it once she got oxygen, she came back alive. And the only thing I remember is looking in Mona's eyes. And Mona, could you bring her picture back up, James? I need to show you something.
Sure. What kind of that?
The picture where she looks kind of dark in the face.
Oh.
Do you see her eyes there?
It looks like the eyelids are closed.
Her eyes are open. See the whites of her eyes?
Mm. Okay, so if it's like a big, long,
slanted. Do you see the eye to the left? It looks like it's got two pupils.
To the left, like over here. This one here.
No, James. Go back to the first picture.
Okay.
Stay on the first picture.
This one here.
Okay, stay on those pictures. See those little spots in her eyes?
Like that right there.
Look to the other eye. Look, she's got more than one eye. See those pupils? See the pupils in her eyes?
Is that another one there?
There's one. Go down below it. There's one there. She's got more than one pupil in her eye. She has maybe 3-4 pupils in each eye.
So does that mean she's like an insect?
Well, that's a good question about the insects. I think because she communicates with locusts, like a fly has many eyes. I don't know if I'm saying it right. She doesn't have to turn her eye any particular way. She's able to see out of each pupil. She can see spectrums of light that we can't see. Okay? But she has several pupils on her eye. She has one eye, but she has several pupils in there. All I remember was that she came to, and she got right up in front of my face, and she looked me in the eye. And that's the last thing I remember. So I have and it's very unusual for me not to have a memory, because every time I worked at Camp Hero, they would tase me with a taser, but my memories always came back. I'm one of these guys that no matter how you tase me, sooner or later, my memory comes back.
Wow, because they thought you wouldn't remember anything.
Well, I'm very unique. You can tase me, disorient me, but it always comes back. But for some reason, I have no recall of my trip back, and she is very much awake in that craft. But when I get back to Earth, what I did was I'm in my suit, and I decompressurized the spacecraft. That much I knew. And because you wear your helmet when you're descending, going down through the atmosphere to the ocean. And I believe that she went back to sleep when we were on the surface. And then because I'm on my oxygen in my spacecraft, my air in my spacecraft, in my suit. I'm in my suit. I have my own air. There's no air in the spacecraft. So she's asleep. And they, like I said, the frogmen come out. They attach a rope to the capsule. They wheel me into the ballistic tube on the submarine. And the same procedure is repeated, except it's just me and the other guy, the other astronaut that was with me from Apollo, the Apollo mission that I was on.
And did they also take back Mona Lisa?
They took Mona Lisa, and they also took the computer that I retrieved. I retrieved the computer, the flight computer, and I retrieved some of the lunar soil, which is no big deal. Basically sampling around, by the crater with some additional samples that I took. I had maybe a little bit of the vegetation and a couple of these 6-7 inch triangular ceramic pyramid things that I took with me back. But an interesting thing occurred once it was, it was sure that I was, not contaminated, because I also was taken to Antarctica. I was eventually brought back to Area 51 and debriefed. But I was told that Mona was at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. That's where she was being stored at. But they had a fire out there. They had to move her. I'm not sure where she went. She was at Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the underground there. Now, a surgeon a few years ago was going to operate on her, and when he put the scalpel on her, he was electrified to death. He died being electrocuted. And I believe that she's able to store energy like an electrical eel, but the surgeon died instantly when he attempted to do an autopsy on her. But she's not dead, but she seems to go into a hibernation, a real deep sleep. Now that very top of her head there, where you see that there's an orifice there that opens. That's her third eye, and it flashes just like you have a camera, an old bulb camera. They would flash. She communicates by light.
Oh, here's another one.
Yeah, that opens and it flashes a light, a very intense light.
What color light?
It's as bright as a camera with the flash of a camera. It's short burst, but the light is telepathic in nature.